Today in Nerd History!
You can show whatever bizarre shit you want to kids, and they'll just sit there and soak it up and let it stew around in their brains, finally manifesting years later in the form of horrible repressed memories. One such ceaseless source of sordid nightmare fuel is Thomas the Tank Engine, which premiered about 30 years ago, and since then has sown seeds of... I've ran out of S's, but the show is terrifying. Here are the 5 creepiest Thomas the Tank Engine stories. Number 1. The sad story of Henry ends with a train walled up forever. If you are an adult human, it's probably been a good few years since you scoped Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends. You most likely have swirling, vague memories of just barely animatronic trains embarking on mostly mundane, unremarkable journeys, while serenaded by the dulcet tones of George Carlin or Ringo Starr's ASMR-style narration. Revisiting the show, however, reveals a dark, totalitarian hellscape where you'd be better off dead than be one of the many indentured trains on the island of Sodor. You don't have to look very far to find depravity in Thomas and Friends. The sad story of Henry is the 3rd episode of the entire series, and it's basically a crueler version of an Edgar Allan Poe story. The plot centers on Henry, one of Sodor's many cherubic-faced trains. On a particularly nasty day, Henry decides he's gonna chill out in a tunnel rather than let his paint job get ruined by the train. Not super profesh, but Henry's far from the only one to feel the urge to stay indoors during a storm. Sir Topham Hatt isn't having it. He's got a railway to run after all, and they don't call you the Fat Controller if you don't demonstrate your doughy domain over your subjects on a regular basis. After a bit of back and forth, Henry makes it clear that under no circumstances will he leave the comfy confines of the tunnel. Taking a page from the Burger King Book of Wishes with Unforeseen Consequences, the Fat Controller lets Henry have his way. Forever.
We shall take away your rails, he said, and leave you here for always and always and always.
Henry doesn't think much of the threat at first, rolling his eyes, but soon enough, the Fat Controller and his men have bricked up the exit to Henry's tunnel. I wasn't exaggerating or joking when I said that this is out of Edgar Allan Poe. Those of you who paid attention in middle school English, God bless you, because you will recognize that this is straight out of the Cask of Amontillado, which is an Edgar Allan Poe story, in case you didn't make that correlation. Oh, that's just the horror story where a man traps his former friend in the catacombs by bricking him into the wall, leaving him to rot with the rest of the Forgotten. You know, lightweight stuff. As you've no doubt pieced together, that's exactly what's happening here. But with one important wrinkle. Henry has enough room to see the outside world. And the outside world can see Henry wasting away, his engine dead. The few interactions Henry gets are from trains living their day-to-day lives. They acknowledge Henry, but in a way that makes it even worse. And I'm not sure what's more sadistic, the train that takes glee in the justice served over Henry's petty crime, or the one that rolls on like this is completely normal. In the American broadcast of this episode, the voiceover assures the audience that Henry's comeuppance is temporary, but Ringo Starr's original narration makes no such promises. Instead, we're left with a disconcerting zoom-in set to Thomas's upbeat theme music, and Ringo leaves us with a haunting message.
But I think he deserved his punishment. Don't you?
This twisted, authoritarian nightmare is not just confined to this episode. Sodor was designed like this from the ground up, dating back to the original books. If you're interested in a deep dive, Jaya Tolentino from The New Yorker has done a fantastic job of breaking down the overt fascist themes in the show's so-called lessons. This story is particularly terrifying in part because it's been with us for decades now and no one's really raised any concerns over it. Hell, there was even a train playset called Henry's Tunnel in case you ever wanted your kid to reenact this twisted fable. To be fair, it's worth mentioning that Henry is eventually freed in a later episode, but in this episode, his eventual release is never mentioned or hinted at, so anyone who catches this isolated out of context will just assume that he actually died there forever. And it only gets darker from here, folks. That was number 1. Here's the rest of them. Number 2, vehicles are brutalized and dismembered all the time. The island of Sodor's favored form of torment is usually hinging on the psychological, but now and again the mildly wicked are brutalized beyond all comprehension. Like all the other characters in this video, these victims committed mild faux pas and their retribution was unduly savage. Take this brake van for instance. Yes, he is certainly a jerk, so much so that his official name is Spiteful Brake Van. But his mean spirit doesn't justify him being literally dismembered on camera in a train accident. I mean, holy shit! That's the brake van's entire body crumpling like a soggy gingerbread house. True to form, just before the spiteful brake fan was making it tougher as it joined trains to make their journey. But it was Douglas the train who slipped up and crushed his colleague. The narrator has the gall to say,
No one had been hurt.
in the crash, referring to the passengers, of course. The brake van's disembodied face would beg to differ. That's just the thing though, the trains, the buses, the other vehicles of Sodor aren't treated like people despite having thoughts and feelings and complete interiority. They're property. I mean, like dogs at best, but usually treated more like livestock. Really, guys like S.E. Ruffy have a good reason to be disgruntled. If I were Ruffy, I'd be a little wary of having a nasty attitude on Sodor. Maybe Ruffy hasn't seen what happens to those who misbehave. Maybe Ruffy resents the Northwestern Railway's harsh zero-tolerance policy. But it probably doesn't matter. You don't really need to know why another train would intentionally pull Ruffy apart at the seams. No context in the world is going to make sense of this horrific shit show. I wish I could say that a train car spilling its innards all over the tracks is the most messed up thing that you'll see today, but I can't at all. Moving on. Number 3, a train stumbles into a mass grave and is almost murdered. We've seen how poorly living trains have it on Sodor, but dead trains are treated even worse somehow, if you'd believe it. See, the scrapyard is a set used in several episodes, and is often treated in a terrified awe by the local locomotives. In train speak, getting scrapped is just a gentle, family-friendly way of saying someone became obsolete and was sent to the junkyard to be killed and gutted for parts. So when the plucky Stepney accidentally stumbles into the scrapyard one night, he is understandably terrified. The heroes in Thomas and Friends are trains. The kid audience is meant to identify with and subsequently purchase toys of these lovable railbound vehicles. So it's a little more than concerning that this universe contains a place in which rusty train corpses can be found carelessly strewn about. This isn't a junkyard. This is a mass grave. Who were these trains and how did they end up here? Judging by the stories we've seen so far, it seems that these bodies belong to those who made a snide remark to the Fat Controller, or maybe sighed a little too loud one day. Taking everything we know about Sodor into account, it's not a stretch to suggest that the lifeless bodies of the insubordinate were left out as a warning to the other trains to stay in line. The episode I mentioned earlier gets even more messed up when Stepney runs into 2 dastardly diesel engine bullies, who push their prey into the smelter shed. This is where trains go before they're scrapped. The claw above Stepney is the last thing you see before you're added to the collection of carcasses outside. Make no mistake, the act of pushing Stepney into the path of this grabber qualifies as homicide or lococide, or I don't know what you call it. It's terrible. Of course, Stepney is saved moments before his demise and scoots home safely. For the crime of attempted murder, those bullies were sentenced to going about their lives as usual. Sounds kind of like the real world. Which sounds about right for Sodor. Number 4, the tale of the living boulder who wanted to destroy everything. This is a strange one, but I mean, it's just too batshit to ignore. Rusty and the Boulder plays out a lot like a horror movie in which the slasher is, well, a giant angry boulder. Rusty tries to warn people about the ominous round rock sitting on top of the mountain as workers mine a new part of the island. Nobody listens, of course, and then we see this face fade into the boulder. Now, it's unclear whether that's Rusty's imagination putting a train-like face on the boulder, but it does seem to have some kind of terrible agency. After the miners push too far, the boulder crashes down, stops for a moment, and then suddenly gains speed, chasing down Rusty. Rolling with incredible speed down the tracks and even across a bridge, the boulder appears to be barreling right for Percy. It misses, but only because Percy hadn't done anything slightly annoying that it might warrant his body being pulverized by a runaway piece of mountain. The boulder's target wasn't the train anyway. It was the station. After the giant fiery explosion rocked the station, the railway decides to put the new mining operation on hold. Rusty's once silly suspicions of supernatural haunting gain a little more weight with the Fat Controller's last words on the matter before moving house.
We should have left this part of the island alone.
The Fat Controller knows more than he's letting on. Because we're offered no other reason or explanation for the boulder's malicious and seemingly intentional behavior, we're left to assume that this part of Sodor is haunted by a malevolent spirit that takes the form of a rampaging boulder to protect its territory. The boulder's motivations are unclear, but it appears to bear a grudge against the railway. Maybe the specter of a train abused in life by the Fat Controller seeking revenge against its tormentor. It might sound like I'm talking a bit out of my ass here, but these ruthless sentences are bound to produce vindictive ghosts. You're dooming yourselves! Can't you see? And finally, number 5, The rude and annoying are instantly doomed to a humiliating punishment for all eternity. Usually running about 5 minutes or so, episodes of Thomas and Friends don't have a lot of time to get their message out there, so the production team needed swift, merciless, exaggerated sanctions so they could squeeze a morality play out of just a few minutes. As a result, the island of Sodor is something like a Greek myth. Screw up even one time in a minor way and you are immediately hit with an excruciating curse that will last the rest of your life. Hell, sometimes you don't even need to do any one thing to have your soul destroyed on Sodor. In the case of Bulstrode the Barge, all it took was one character to say something along the lines of, "Boy, that Bulstrode sure is disagreeable, eh?" And fate immediately came crashing down on him, in the form of several trucks loaded with rocks. This was an accident on the part of another train, who isn't even reprimanded for nearly killing a coworker, mind you. But nonetheless, everyone around rejoices. Cranky, moody, and otherwise problematic vehicles are seen as a blight on Sodor, and any sudden misfortune they might suffer is basically a chance for self-righteous passerbys to mock the unfortunate. Bulstrode didn't sink, but probably wishes he had. Instead of patching him up or even sending him to the scrapyard, the railway pushed him onto the beach and left him there, for good. This brutal reprisal is, to say the least, a tad disproportionate to Bulstrode's minor infraction of being kind of a dick. No amount of snobbery or cranky remarks warrants a Sisyphean punishment like leaving a boat stranded a few yards from water for all time. Oh right, unlike Henry, there is no rescue for Bulstrode. His wiki page consists of a single stumpy paragraph ending in, "He remains there today, most likely still grumbling." Even the people who write Thomas the Tank Engine wiki pages can't help but stick it to this guy. Of all the fates in Sodor, however, Smudger's is probably the worst. As you can no doubt tell from his smirking mug, Smudger is a giant asshole. He speeds wherever he goes, never discouraged by his frequent derailments. Smudger definitely deserved to be taught a lesson, but not like this. Nobody deserves to be turned into a generator and left behind a shed. But of course, that's what happened to Smudger. Look at that face! Smudger is just now realizing the enormity of the situation, the utter hopelessness of his existence from this point forward. It doesn't matter whether or not Smudger learned a lesson, nor does anyone seem to care whether his harrowing experiences as a motionless generator might have changed his outlook on life. Smudger will never get to show anyone that he's changed, because this is Sodor, and rehabilitation is not an option. Instead, Smudger stands as a cautionary tale that is intended to scare trains into behaving, lest they too be sentenced to a living purgatory. The worst part of it all is that Smudger is not even a visible example anymore. I mean, not after the landslide. The end of Smudger's only episode is capped off with a time-lapse of his old station being retaken by nature. A few trains are hibernating nearby, and we're given a clear to-be-continued tease that assures us that all of our heroes will make it out okay next time. And for the most part, that's true. All the trains are rescued. All except Smudger, who is never mentioned again in the entire series. In all likelihood, he's still there, just buried under some dirt, wondering if anyone will ever come by, wondering if this is part of his punishment. He's not. He was just forgotten, much like any sense of humanity on the island of Sodor.